Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here, and if I go too fast, just slow me down, sorry. I'm here today to share with you the experience of the renewable crash test dummies of the world, which is my homeland. We're doing more to destroy our electrical grid than anyone else around the world, rapidly getting right into it. So I wanted to help everyone else to compete with us and hopefully outdo us, because that might be the only thing that saves Australian manufacturing. Ladies and gentlemen, how do we destroy a perfectly good electricity grid in 3 easy steps, except it might be 5 complicated steps, but you know, that's how the advertising works. You always say it's 3 easy steps even when it isn't. That's the name of renewables, isn't it? For 100 years, we had good grids. Bountiful, reliable electricity at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. It brought fresh food and perfect temperatures to Australia. Clearly, it was time to do something different. So we're doing it. To destroy a perfectly good grid is harder than you think. It takes lots of money, buckets of cash, and you have to overcome the free market, completely bypassing the force of independent competition, which will, if given half a chance, outdo you at every step and get back to cheap electricity. And you have to make sure consumers can't just pick a cheap, reliable alternative. So here we go. Now, you're probably wondering, which would be sensible, why? I mean, seriously, why destroy a perfectly good grid? So I'm here to talk about the joy of blackouts. Yes. Now, blackouts are very underrated. I mean, really, they can be great fun, and we find out how much fun maybe 9 months later. Or blackouts bring us back to nature and remind us of why we don't like being hot, cold, or hungry, or bored, or tired, or not being able to access our Facebook pages, etc. It's therapy for screen-addicted kids. Yes, yeah, hands up who's got a screen-addicted kid at home. Or yeah, we all do. Some of us are screen-addicted kids. It's great for observing stars. As far as astronomers are concerned, the only time they can do things without light pollution, which is perfect as long as they've charged up their batteries and put kerosene in the lamps. It's really good. Blackouts are the ideal thing for all the wood-fired telescopes in the world. Yes. Well, none of them. And in the end, it's the only 100% perfect antidote to the mainstream media, isn't it? It's the only time they're unbiased and accurate. So that's if your media is like our media. Now, so having sold you on the idea of why you need blackouts, well, yes. The other good thing about destroying your grid is it creates jobs, lots of jobs, although they're in places with names like Haiku and Heng Shui. So good if you live in China. Oh, sorry, this slide's not meant to be there. That's from another talk where I talk about ancient pagan Gaia symbols and things. Yes, otherwise known as the crescent dunes in California, big solar thing. Now, our challenge in Australia is significant. It's probably harder for us than anyone, although I'm willing to be convinced that maybe it's harder for you with the oil and whatnot resources you have. But Australia starts from way back in the field when it comes to destroying electricity grids. Our biggest challenge is our coal, because we have far too much of it. We're the largest exporter of coal in the world. Although, just to put that in perspective, China digs up 7 to 10 times as much coal as we do. We just happen to be the people in the world who dig up way more than we can use. Therefore, we are the largest exporter in the world. I think something like 1/3 of global trade in coal comes from Australia. It is 3% of our GDP. It employs, I think, 50,000 people. It brings in $50 billion a year to the Australian economy, and our resources we're the 4th largest recoverable coal reserves in the world, will run out in about 300 years. In other words, we could make $50 billion a year and power 70% of our electricity on our coal and keep going for another 297 years. But our government wants to stop it really soon, and the Greens would like to not only stop it but put you in jail if you're using coal after the year 2030. Now, in terms of uranium, we Oh, sorry, yeah, that's a coal export graph. So that's us on the graph. Indonesia sometimes beats us, but mostly not, and Russia and South Africa, etc., etc. Obviously, in the coal export stakes, we win. Now, in terms of uranium, that is us there, Canada, Kazakhstan. Again, we have the largest reserves of uranium in the world. I'll just put that in perspective. Yes, it's crazy large. It's ridiculous. Now, there are 450 nuclear power plants around the world, and in Australia, we have none of them. That's right. We don't even use nuclear energy. We are that bonkers. And thorium, we're not even thinking about thorium. We are the largest reserve in the world of thorium, or we were in 2009. I'm not sure if that's still accurate. And if it seems really unlikely, maybe we are not just God's gift to resources. Maybe we're just really good explorers. It's possible, and I could be convinced. But at the moment, we must be top of the tables, especially with a population of only 25 million people. So we're about the size of California and a third of the size of Germany, and we have lots of resources. Aluminium, this is just a sad case. We are the largest exporter of bauxite, which is the mineral that aluminium comes from. So again, we win on that stake. But we're only the 6th largest exporter of aluminium, because what does it take to convert bauxite to aluminium? Lots of electricity. So we, at one point, had 6 smelters. It used 15% of our total national electricity grid and employed 17,000 people. But we're working on that. We've reduced it from 6 down to 4. And we've also broken one of the pot lines at one of those smelters. They only have 2 pot lines, so that's half a smelter gone. We had a blackout. It lasted more than 3 hours. Those aluminium pot lines don't survive if you have a blackout for more than 3 hours, because the aluminium is set solid. You need warning of blackouts with big aluminium smelters. Once it's set solid, you basically throw it away. You can't reuse it. You have to rebuild it. It costs millions of dollars. I don't think they're bothering to re-engage and start that one up again. It's just not worth it. So, interesting perspective on one of the downfalls of blackouts. But in any case, now electricity prices in Australia, this is way back in 1955, have been coming down for like 40 years. All hard-working engineers, really good at what they did, reduced the price of electricity consistently year after year after year. Well, clearly that had to change. And we've managed that. In terms of achievements, there's us again, 1994, at the bottom of the pack. In terms of prices, really not doing very well at all. Cheap energy everywhere. So, to get serious, we've done it. In the last 10 years, we've cracked it, and we are, South Australia at least, is up there in electricity stakes, beating Denmark, Germany and Italy. Now, the losers down here, the US, Estonia and Hungary and whatnot, I thought I'd look at them and just see how much, what kind of electricity they use. Maybe they have far too much of that free and cheap stuff, you know, wind and solar, but as it happens, it turns out not. Almost none of these countries have wind power in any significant form. It's just other stuff, nuclear, hydro, coal, things like that. So anyway, yeah, so South Australia is doing stunningly well there. Small place, 1.6 million people. Now, so there's the graph joining in. That fall in electricity prices I showed you before, this is all indexed to inflation, and there it is. Somewhere around 2007, the 60-year trend suddenly changes. I wonder what could have happened then. This is coincidentally intermittent power generation coming in, starting in Australia in a big way in about 2005, and it's all just off the charts up here. But you can see there's just a bit of a coincidence between the amount of unreliable power brought into Australia and those things, the mysterious price rise. Let's have a look at what kind of energy we used to use when we had cheap electricity back in the 90s. Here it is. So we've, back then, this is coal. And this is also coal. That's brown, that's black coal, and, that's black, that's brown, and then we've got gas. This is hydro. And up here, marked at the top of the graph in bright iridescent green, are all the wind and solar plants we had back then. Exactly. Exactly. Here it's changed. These are the renewables feeding in. Around about 2011, they start to turn up on our national graphs. That colour is wind, that green. and that is solar PV, the rooftop. We're getting a lot of those now. And solar, big solar, those huge thermal plants like Crescent Dunes, that, I think there's a spot there and there and there and there and there. So you can see it doesn't take much in the way of renewables to really destroy a grid and your prices. We really haven't got a lot, and yet we're achieving so much. And yeah, that just puts together the last kind of 40 years of electricity consumption per sector. And it was rising until we got a Labor government in there and high electricity prices, and now we're just not using as much electricity as we were. The funny thing that happens with supply and demand, and when people run out of money, they've stopped using so much electricity. And we have got a lot of rooftop solar which generates electricity that doesn't get counted as consumption. So to be fair, we can thank renewable rooftops, which now cover about a quarter of houses in Australia. We have put a lot of infrastructure on roofs to catch sunlight. And let's face it, Australia is something between 12 degrees from the equator down to about 45 degrees. So we're really quite close. We're very well positioned to pick up solar. If solar was going to work and be cheap anywhere in the world, we're it. So if solar fails in Australia, yeah. So here is, sorry, there should be a year on this. This is December 2017, so this is fairly recent, although stuff is changing. We've got significantly more solar and wind since this graph. So wind is the light blue one. Good old black coal again. Brown coal is the, or liquids actually, liquids diesel. No, brown coal. I'm sure that's brown coal, that's black coal. And gas is the red stuff. And then renewables is this really light coloured stuff on the top. Like I said, it doesn't take much. Our total grid is 56,000 megawatts, 56 gigawatts. Of that, 6 gigawatts is intermittent renewables, wind and solar. So it really is a small part of the total production. And here's the scariest thing I only found out on the plane over here. In December last year, when that graph was done, we only had 4 gigawatts then of renewables. So it's gone up by 2 gigawatts in the last 12 months. We're on that part of the curve in terms of destruction. This is one of the reasons we're doing it. It's called the Renewable Energy Target. Someone decided, Conservative government actually, way back then, that we should increase our renewables like by 2% a year. Thank you. And we are now at this point 16% and aiming for 20, regardless of whatever the consequences. And so this is an artificial target coming in, and the Greens in our country complain that we have had no policy certainty, and we've had bickering and fighting by all the governments, and they don't help at all with renewables. But the truth of the matter is we've had relentless subsidies every single year, every day for the last 20 years, saying that we must buy renewable energy. We have a certificate market scheme, and it works. We're getting renewable. So that scheme's called the RET, Renewable Energy Target. To give you some idea of the solar situation in Australia, way back in 2008, we had barely any solar panels on roofs, only a few, and since then we're, headed up here into what I call the death spiral, because solar panels on roofs are subsidised by the other people who don't have solar panels, basically. So every consumer pays part of the subsidy for installing these. But if you don't have them and your electricity bills are unaffordable, your only choice is to get some. The average consumer pays about half of the cost, like $4,000, and the other $4,000 roughly comes from the Renewable Energy Target, which means other consumers. So it's a system that's, it's not directly a subsidy because other consumers are forced to buy it, but it means that, as I said, we're in a death spiral now. You kind of can't afford not to have solar in our country, but the more solar people get, the worse the price rises are. The next year, I think I've seen estimates of more than $1 billion is going to be added to electricity bills in the country just to pay for the cost of installing all these solar panels. And we'll talk more about how useful they are or aren't. This is a wonderful graph showing renewable energy and the price of electricity. So there's the electricity cost in cents, 30 cents, 25 cents, 20, and this is the installed capacity, the watts per capita, per head. Australia hits above its weight here. We've got only so many renewables and a much higher price than the trend line. Again, we just can't help it. We're so successful. There's a few reasons for that. It could be because we don't have any nuclear, and we also have some hydro, but not as much hydro as what people who have real mountains have. We could use another mountain range if you want to sell us one. We could. Ewan Mearns in Ireland did a brilliant graph where he said, well, let's take out the hydro and see whether renewables really are responsible for this trend. So he took out the hydro, and this is what we get. That line neatens up well and truly. Wind and solar are the driving line under that correlation. It's only correlation, but you can see there, the more renewables you have, the more expensive your electricity is. There is no country in the world which has a lot of renewables, the intermittent kind, and cheap electricity, just zero. So people complexify the debate, don't they? We all hear how they say wind is cheaper than coal now, and isn't it wonderful? Solar's coming down in price so much and it's so cheap. But the truth is the hidden costs of both of these sorts of unreliable energy, the hidden costs are so expensive that not one country with a lot of them has cheap electricity. There's a message in that. Now, what's Australia done? As I said, we've faced with this kind of data, we've increased our solar and wind by 50% in the last 12 months. So all the graphs I show you on Australia are essentially already out of date. Whatever we're having, it's coming, and it's coming soon, and watch this space. Money, yes, we're giving away lots of it. The blackouts, unfortunately, are very expensive. That is one of the downsides to having blackouts. In South Australia, they burnt through about $470 million in the space of that blackout, which mostly took about 4 or 5 hours to get electricity back in South Australia after it crashed and they had a statewide blackout. But it took several days to get electricity right around the corner to the furthest sort of little towns and reaches. And it took 2 weeks to get Olympic Dam, one of the biggest mines in the world, restarted and going again. So for 2 weeks, one of our largest industrial projects in the country sat idle, stuck, without electricity. Yes, we are bonkers. Tasmania has a Basslink cable. Tasmania is the little island down the bottom of Australia, and it has one interconnector underneath the Bass Strait, which is a pretty viciously rough, I think it's about 400-kilometre stretch. So it's an ambitious cable. That broke, and that cost Tasmania about $500 million before they could fix it again. And to put that in perspective, one gas plant, a fossil fuel plant in Australia, costs about $250 million. So they could have built 2 fossil fuel gas plants for the same price as having that cable break, and the cost of then having to fly in squads of diesel generators as they did to rescue the state. Prior to that, it had been renewable, 100% renewable, for about 4 months. So, yeah, look, we won't get into too many details on this. Alan Moran has added up all the costs in Australia. This is a couple of years ago. Obviously, it's worse now. Back then, the government federally was spending nearly $4 billion a year. States were doing their own things and adding another $1 billion a year to that. Now it's even more, and the solar scheme's really going crazy. So we're looking at lots of money being spent every year to build this infrastructure, which works some of the time. It's about $600 per household then. It's probably more like $800 now when we add the solar new renewable subsidies on, added to people's bills. Now, step one, if you're really serious about destroying a grid, which I hope you are, the first and most important thing to do is just to change, to repurpose some of your large industrial machinery. So where you have a large power plant that you think is there to generate electricity, the secret is just to repurpose it. These are no longer industrial electrical generation plants. In Australia, they are now global climate controllers. They change the weather. You laugh, but we're having no fun here. Now, I know, well, you've got to laugh till you cry. What else is it good for when you destroy infrastructure worth so much? So, look, this is, I think it's your lawn in Victoria, I think. Anyway, a lovely coal-fired plant. We think it might generate electricity, but in actual fact, this is stopping floods and drought. Well, actually, it's creating floods and droughts, isn't it? Because that's what coal does. It's really evil. And so if you want more floods and droughts, build more coal plants. And it's also lowering the IQ of bearded dragons, which I know you're all worried about. We certainly are. Can't afford any more dumb bearded dragons. Now, reckless fish, it's making fish reckless. Little tropical Nemo fish get more reckless when you add more CO2 to the air. It's been proven, it's been in peer-reviewed journals, and you all know how important they are. Okay, so once you've relabelled these bits of infrastructure, which cost millions, billions to build, then you can do things like stop floods. Other places build levees. We use different kinds of power, put up some wind turbines, that'll do it. Does it remind anyone of ancient witchcraft, you know, where the shaman used to stand up and say, "We will stop the storms, give me your conch shells," or whatever, money. I just put that one in because I like that shot. It's a coal plant, but it looks quite pretty at night anyway. And of course, with those big plumes of steam coming off the top, which everyone calls pollution. Yes, so we have better generators now. We have solar panels and wind farms in Australia that work, you know, about a third or maybe a sixth of the time that we need them. Step 2, yes, picking the intermittent, unreliable and inefficient way to change the weather. Because, of course, if we could build nuclear plants, which would be really low in CO2 emissions, couldn't we? But we don't. We could make our coal plants upgraded and we could be as good as Japan, Indonesia and China and have plants which are high temperature supercritical coal, which would use a lot less CO2, but we don't do that either because that would mean building a new coal plant and that's against the religion. Instead, we need to pick intermittent ways, unreliable ways to do it. Here's wind in Australia. Now, we're a massive continent. We are enormous. 4,000 kilometres across, 4,000 kilometres up, 7 million square kilometres, and this is our national wind turbine output 1 month. Now, I could pick any month and it would be the same because about twice a month, our entire national wind fleet produces nothing. Now, this is 3,000 megawatts then. We've added another 1,000 gigawatt of wind since this graph, but it doesn't matter because the effect is the same. You can put all of these wind turbines graphed in there, but there are still times over Australia where the wind just stops. It's when we get these kind of high pressure cells, and when they get a high pressure cell here, almost all the wind farms are somewhere around there. They all just stop. The wind's dead everywhere. Yeah, like I said, what we need is another mountain range. So if you want to sell us yours, we're interested. Solar power, believe it or not, is often the same thing. Yeah, it's a sunny country. We have lots of sun, but we do get clouds. Here's a cloud bank here, which is covering up like 90% of the solar panels in Australia all at once in the same moment. I mean, to put that in perspective, I come from Perth, somewhere over here where there were also clouds right at that particular point. But there's no extension cord between Perth and Adelaide, so it doesn't really matter whether we have sun and they don't. We can't help them because it's like 2,700 kilometres from there to there, so no one's got a cord that long. Thank goodness, because that's the only thing that saves us in WA, or we'd be looking at blackouts too. Now, this is total rooftop solar in Australia on a normal sunny day. Most of the time it's really useful at midday, really obviously not useful at midnight or early in the morning. This is a cloudy day, so there's 1,000 megawatts just gone. But, you know, we cope with that because we've got fossil fuel backup. And at any time when there's clouds roll over, say, just Sydney, we can lose 200 or 300 megawatts of power, just like that in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, disappears, and we've got to deal with that. We don't know how often it really happens because there's not much data, but this is day by day with our solar and all the states that are on the eastern seaboard, because WA isn't mentioned because we don't count because we're not part of that grid. But you can see most days it's good, but then there's days when every state is hopeless for solar as well, just can't rely on it. Now, I'm a little bit baffled here, maybe you can help me. We had a system where built up infrastructure, it took 2 generations to build all the coal-fired and gas-fired plants so that we had reliable, cheap electricity. Now, the plan is that if we add infrastructure, which works occasionally, maybe sometimes, and which might change the weather and make the world cooler about the time I have my 130th birthday, but not by an amount measurable enough to tell whether it actually worked, we added in, you know, some wind, lots of wind, even more wind, heaps of wind. And yeah, heaps. And then we put solar panels on as well. And my big question with this is, with all of these things being so unreliable, working on a random basis, how is it that we are going to get cheaper electricity? Because we paid a lot of money for these. It took 30 years to pay off each one of these big bits of infrastructure and get the mortgage down to nothing. Now we're adding all this other infrastructure, but this doesn't replace any of this. We essentially can't get rid of this base load because on a cloudy day, as you see, we get almost nothing out of this network of infrastructure. At any one point, a lot of Australian infrastructure is sitting around doing nothing. But those coal plants over there, they still have to pay their capital bills, their costs, their staff, their maintenance, their wages. The maintenance goes up because, you know, well, it's like driving in the city, up and down with the car, faster, slower, you higher maintenance bills. So they save on fuel but spend more on everything else, and then they hire all these people who get to sit around when the wind blows and, I don't know, watch cat videos on YouTube or something. How does that work out cheaper? How is that ever going to be cheaper for us? And it doesn't matter how many wind farms and solar panels we put on, we're still going to need the backup. Or we're going to need to buy batteries. Oh, don't talk to me about batteries. Okay, now step 3, you really can't achieve this unless you have big government. Australia used to, for 100 years, kind of, 80 years, we had, all the separate states had their own grids, and it worked just fine. Even no matter how dumb the state governments were, they couldn't be too dumb for too long. To really stuff a national grid, you've got to join it up together and put one person in charge. Sooner or later, one dumb cluck will wreck it properly. So in Australia, this is our national grid on this side of the country. So there's sort of 22 million people here, about 2 million in this little grid, and about 2 million camels in there. They don't get any electricity yet. But so here's our big grid. It's about 40,000 kilometres or something ridiculous of cables, but there's only kind of one infrastructure like here, one interconnector there, one interconnector there. They're very fragile points. And when they go down, that's when, you know, we lose South Australia, because that's the Haywood interconnector there, 800 megawatts. And we did fine without those. That's why I'm glad they're not going to build one from here to here. The cost, they do want to build another one from, essentially from Adelaide across here, but it will cost $1.5 billion to put in the wires and cables. It's a seriously long way. That will help wind power. It'll mean that the too much wind that they've got here is going to be able to destroy the baseload suppliers over here as well. Okay, and just so you get the size of it, I thought I would do this nice graph connecting up thetruesize.com. It's a great website. And so I dragged Australia over so you can see what it looks like. I'm sorry it's in pink. I'm more sorry than you can know that it's pink. Our whole nation pink. Yes. Well, Europe's had its pink phases before. You know what that was like. Now, and of course, to really wreck things, you've got to get the right person. In this case, Malcolm Turnbull, our former Prime Minister, brought this lady in, a lovely lawyer called Audrey Zibelman, who was from New York, who was possibly going to work with the Hillary Clinton team, and then they hit a snag in 2016 and she needed a job. So escapees of the Hillary campaign ended up managing Australia's grid. And Audrey Zibelman has said great things like, I believe we're the last generation on Earth who can really do something about climate change. Just the kind of person you want managing your national grid. Technology has changed, she said, and resisting this change is a little like trying to resist the internet. Think about that one. I mean, seriously, remember back in 1995 when the internet was starting and governments had to bring in all those rules so that we used the internet and that got subsidised, because otherwise who would have got the internet, you know? I mean, who are we kidding? The internet is nothing like renewable energy. It's taken over the world because it was useful. So, yeah, and she's also said we don't have to worry about sacrificing economics for good environmental policy. That's because in magic fairy cake land, it's all free. Yeah. Okay, now it is important, as I mentioned, you have to cripple the free market. That's really crucial here, because without crippling the free market, it will find a way around whatever you do, and people will get cheap electricity. So in Australia, we have lots of coal plants. Now, you just cannot legally put coal plants together with houses and just run that wire straight through and avoid all the carbon taxes and the renewable energy targets and things like that. However, if you are a cryptocurrency from China and you know the rules well enough, you are free to build a factory really close to a coal plant in Australia, within a kilometre, and get electricity direct, in which case you can pay 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And they have done a deal like that with a very small coal plant, which shows how cheaply we can still do electricity in Australia if we're given the chance. So the Chinese will get that, but the locals who are in a town 10 kilometres away, they get to pay all the other things, and they're paying 28 cents a kilowatt hour. So free market, gotta love it. Wish we had it. The big fear of Audrey Zibelman running our grid is that the big players may leave the grid. We could make electricity so expensive that even with all the advantages of mass action and huge efficiencies and economies of scale, people don't want to be on it. And she's afraid of that because they are starting to consider leave. And that example of the Chinese cryptocurrency group, they've left the grid. They didn't come to Australia and say, can we buy your electricity? They came to Australia and said, can we do a deal that's outside of your national grid so that we can afford it and make money off it? So big players are starting to leave the grid, and the only limit to how expensive electricity can get in Australia is what it costs to buy a diesel generator and put it in your backyard, because that's what people are going to do, and farmers are already doing that because they can't afford a blackout. If there's a frost coming and they've got equipment and sprinklers and things to deal with the frost, the blackouts catch them, they just can't afford to switch off, and they can't afford to lose a whole crop. So farmers are buying diesel generators. And so obviously big companies and some hospitals are even getting spare ones. In the South Australian blackout, some people were left on the operating table and the lights did go out, and in one case the backup generator didn't work. And people were stuck on planes and other people were stuck on trains. Everything needs electricity these days. And so it was havoc. It was lucky no one died in that South Australian blackout of the 1.6 million people there. That was most fortunate. Unfortunately, some IVF embryos didn't make it through because they did defrost. Sad for them and their families. But anyway, when we ask Australians what they want to pay for renewables, the answer is not much. 62% of Australians don't want to pay even $10 a month for renewables, and most of those people answering that question did not realise they're already paying more than that, because it's all hidden in their electricity bills. They just know electricity is expensive, and people are saying electricity is expensive in Australia because we don't have enough wind and solar. No kidding. And it's expensive because we have policy friction, freezing, we have no action and government's conflicted. Well, I showed you our renewable energy scheme. There's no uncertainty in that. There's certain profits for renewable energy companies and certain pain for everyone else. And yes, we've seen other surveys in other countries. 60% of Germans don't want to pay one more euro cent, and 42% of US adults don't want to pay even $1 a month to stop climate change. We all know if you ask the right question, 98% of people will say they believe in climate change. Hallelujah. But if you ask another question, how much do you want to pay to change the weather? The answer is not a lot. So there are survey after survey. We need to do more of our own surveys and ask the right questions to find out what people think. So are you, no one's sending me a message or, okay, sorry. Now this is a great study done in the US, because people wouldn't do a study this simple and obvious in Australia, but it's talking about the long-term cost from coal, and the costs are the selling electricity. Here's a $30 a megawatt US price, 40, 50, 60, up to $100. So here's a coal plant, it gets born there, and then it reaches the age of 30 here, and then we can throw a party because they've paid off all the capital costs. So this is the capital cost being paid off over 30 years for a large coal plant. And then you get unbelievably sweet, brilliant $30 a megawatt hour electricity, which is what we were getting from our old coal plants. And, you know, here's 56 years. And then there's a theory that coal plants get too old and go off and die somewhere when they're 50 years old, but actually it's just a piece of machinery and you can keep fixing it. And indefinitely, in theory, you could just keep going on and on. One of the really old coal plants in Australia, which we've turned off, is Hazelwood. God, that's a beautiful shot, really, isn't it? Hazelwood was 53 years old in March 2017, and it was still producing electricity at $30 a megawatt hour. So we did the only sensible thing and shut it down. Because we could have been more sensible and blown it up, and we haven't done that yet. But we have blown up some of them in South Australia, because that's what you do with old infrastructure that you spent 30 years paying off. And they've blown up all of their useful ones in South Australia, just about. This is Liddell. It's still working. It's a coal plant in New South Wales. It's interesting because they're going to shut it down in 3 or 4 years, and it was sold by the New South Wales state government for nothing. It was literally given like a McHappy Meal along with another coal plant, which they did sell for money, and they said, why don't you just take both? So the company did. And now that it's got it, it doesn't want to keep it going. It's going to shut it down in 2022. Everyone's starting to go, oh no, panic, panic, because we're really getting squeezed here for baseload power, and the company will not sell it. Other companies have offered $250 million to buy this, and the company would rather throw it in the bin, and I'll show you why. Because here's our strange auction system, a strange system that worked for years and years and years, but has stopped working now. And in our bidding system, all these companies, this is, you know, different, this is Liddell here. They are bidding in and saying, well, we can provide electricity for $20 a megawatt hour and we can provide this much. And there's another coal plant there. So there's a whole bunch of players all saying, well, we can provide this much. So our geniuses in the market say, well, how much do we need? We need that much. So all of you bidders are losers. You guys are all winners, and you're all going to get paid at the same rate. So it's a system, apparently it is quite common. It sounds odd, but apparently it's quite normal. All of them get the winning bid. So whatever this is, they're all happy because they get this paid the same rate. And obviously, if you remove, let's just get rid of Liddell, it's going to shift this bar over this way, which means it's jumped up in price. And all of these are going to get the new higher price. Well, that works out pretty well if you're a large company that happens to own coal as well as gas, as well as wind, as well as, you know, all these expensive options up here. If you can get rid of some more of these low-base providers down the bottom, everybody's happy except the consumer. Bad luck for them. But who represents the consumer? I don't know. In theory, in a democracy, it's supposed to be our MPs, isn't it? Yeah, we live in hope. Well, we did vote for them. We deserve what we get. And now, here's what happened when they shut Hazelwood, that coal plant I showed you. Before that, brown coal was winning those bids, so they were cheap prices. After that, it was just too far over the line, and suddenly other things started winning the bids because there wasn't enough brown coal in the system to set the price, to win that final winning bid. So now the price is set by black coal, which is more expensive, or wind or hydro or something else. And suddenly we got a huge price jump, and it shifted literally the month that that plant closed. Yes, in other signs of success in Australia, BlueScope Steel, an enormous steel company, it has the leader of that has said energy costs in the United States were up to 10 times lower than it pays in Australia. So they're looking at moving some of their steel production to the US. Joy, their electricity price has gone up 93% in the last 2 years. So like I said, we're on that part of the curve, and it's only going to get better. So in Australia, we're reviving 100-year-old diesel technology right now. South Australia had to bring in a whole squad of them to help out after the blackout. And then the Basslink cable broke for Tasmania, so they borrowed, I think, some of the same fleet and flew them over to Tassie. So anyway, we're reviving diesel and being a progressive green nation. The diesel gen guys are very happy. Their sales are going well. In another sign of success, this is Australian real net national disposable income, the kind of spare money people have in their pockets to buy things. And you can see that way back to 1960, year after relentless year, it improved, improved, improved. We had a recession here. It was the worst recession since the Great Depression in Australia. But we recovered. And then this is the GFC. Yeah, exactly. How big was that? And then this is something else. What could it be that's happened in the last 7 or 8 years? And you can see we've run out of spare cash. So now our shops are struggling because consumers don't have as much money to spend on Christmas presents and things like that. Everything else is tightened up. And of course, electricity affects everything. When the price of electricity goes up, so does everything, because, well, it only applies to things that need heating, cooling or moving, doesn't it? But yeah, in the shops, everything on the shelf was moved or is heated or cooled or cooked or sealed in plastic or something. So electricity costs then start to add a little bit to every other thing we buy. It's great fun. Yeah, the GFC looks so insignificant there, doesn't it? All right, Australia's electricity CPI. You can see our electricity price tracked, our CPI. That's a consumer price index, which is inflation, basically. Electricity tracked inflation until things got super silly. And here is the electricity price since about 2008. There's that magic year where we started bringing in renewables. Not that that's got anything to do with this, but, and there's wages and electricity, wages and the other inflation. This is electricity. Yeah, spot the pattern. Country going down the tubes. Wholesale electricity prices, since we formed our national grid, you know, we joined all the states together. South Australia only got joined to the rest of the nation with a big wire in 1990. Tasmania only got its big wire running under the Bass Strait in 2005. So really couldn't wreck this system until we joined it all together and put one person in charge. Prices stayed at around $35 a megawatt hour for years. This is a horrible drought in 2007. That's why all the prices leapt up there. Not only was our hydro affected because of the drought, but even our coal plants, would you believe, didn't have enough water for cooling. It was that bad. So that was a drought. Then things went back to normal. Then we had a carbon tax, and we even sort of recovered from the carbon tax. And now we've just got some mysterious, weird thing making all the electricity wholesale prices go through the roof. And we're getting price spikes. Someone's having lots of fun in our market, and those price spikes are hitting over the number of times they're greater than $100 a megawatt hour, a lot. And for some reason our government put a cap on the prices people could bid. You cannot ask for more than $14,500 a megawatt hour if you are a generator in Australia. And we're only hitting that price. It's an unbelievable price per gigawatt hour. Millions of dollars goes down the tubes when we hit those kind of prices. And it's changing the way people bid and buy futures in the electricity market. When they had a 2-day blackout in January, in South Australia and Victoria, electricity cost $400 million in that price spike, that 2-day heat wave. $400 million was just burnt in a price spike for 2 days. It's just insane. Okay, yeah, prices did not really even rise with inflation in some respects over the last few decades because we got better at doing electricity and more efficient at it. But as you can see, something really has changed now. We're in new unmarked territory as far as prices go, and I don't think there's any going back, and not unless we do something like we'd have to actually break contracts and knock over some of those wind turbines or something, I think. We're not going to do that. And Flinders Island, now this is an interesting little island north of Tasmania. It's this one up here in the Bass Strait. There's no cable. It's stuck on its own with diesel generators. This is renewable heaven. If there was a place on Earth where renewables were going to be useful, this would be it. This is in the Roaring Forties. That's the name of the wind stream that goes over this island, the Roaring Forties. So you can imagine it's a great place for wind. It's described as the ideal place for tidal energy. Not that anyone can get tidal energy to work yet, but when they achieve 100% renewables, the promise is the prices won't be going down. So where's all that cheap wind and solar energy? Where is it? It should be cheaper than diesel gens in a small island with only 700 people, and it isn't. So yeah, and Tasmania, oh, it's a beautiful place, and it's got that cable running down, the Basslink cable. That has been out of action twice in the last 3 years, and yeah, still not quite sure why it broke, but When it broke, I don't even know that we had boats that could fix it. I think we had to get some from up here where you guys have heaps of cables everywhere, and I think we needed to get one down. And then they needed 17 days with no storms on the Bass Strait in order to fix it, and they had to wait 5 months. Now, this story really is funny. In terms of bureaucracy, this is going to go down in the legend books. In Tasmania, it is a lot of hydro. They've got some mountains. Rare, I know they're rare in Australia, but they've got some. And they have hydro. This is their water storage. Now, here's where the carbon tax comes in Australia, when Julia Gillard decided that a carbon tax would save the world and make us all cooler. She put that in, and then they started to realise they could sell their water to Victoria as electricity and just pump electricity back over that cable and make money from it, extra good money from the renewable energy target and the carbon tax and all these things. So they did, and they ran their dams down a bit low. And then we had an El Nino, which means in Australia that you don't get much rain on the east coast. It's hot, dry weather when we have an El Nino. And then they had another El Nino, and things were looking pretty serious. Now, around about here, some genius in Tasmania thought, why don't we shut down our last gas-fired fossil fuel plant? One they'd only built in 2009. It cost $230 million in 2009, but no one needed it because, you know, they had hydro and wind and other stuff. So they shut it down about there where the red arrow is. And then, what bad luck, yes, they were 100% renewable for about 4 months, and then the cable broke. If there is a God, I swear, then, you know, there's a message there. And so Tassie was then left relying on hydro with its dams down at 20% and no rain expected because it was summer. And it was, you know, they ran their dams down, but we're looking at pretty crisis territory. They got down to 13% full, and they were flying in those squads of diesel from South Australia, because I think South Australia had finished with them by then, and they were sending in the diesel to try and keep the lights on in the state, which was 100% renewable only a few months before. Then this gets better. See where that was about May the next year, so they still had another month to go before they fixed the cable, and the rains had come back and the dam level had recovered. About then, an enormous storm front came down from Sydney, and it went through Sydney, and it was so bad you may have seen photos of pools washed onto the beach and floods everywhere, savage floods. And in the face of that, some other genius in Tasmania said now would be a great time to cloud seed. So they did. To generate electricity, they put planes up and they cloud seeded so that they could get even more water that they could sell back to Victoria and make some money back to cover the cost of all the blackouts. So, you know, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, they did this. It's just incredible. And lucky no one died. Or actually, I think someone did go missing, and I think someone did actually drown in the floods. But I don't think that had anything to do with the cloud seeding. But there were flood warnings in Tasmania that day before they started doing cloud seeding. I mean, climate change makes people do strange things. Yeah, that's the Tamar Valley gas plant, the last gas plant in Tasmania, which they built in 2009, shut down in August of 2016, and then had to reopen again the following year. And that's one of the beaches washed up in the storm front. That's one of the floods from the storm front. That's one of the waves in the storm front. Yeah, and that's the cloud seeding. Okay, it could be the first time in the world people have done cloud seeding to generate electricity. And how green is that? You know, what the diesel fuel or avgas or something like that. Luckily, they're all solar-powered planes in Tasmania. Sorry, solar-powered planes are useless. Okay, grid basics. Now, we must have some engineers here. There's usually some people who, yeah, okay, all right, good. Well, for everyone else who's not familiar with this, electricity is actually really hard to understand, and it's been one of the hardest topics I've ever had to communicate, but it's just amazing. It's fascinating, and it's just shocking that it actually works, really, except in Tasmania where it stopped working. But, sorry, South Australia. Here's the South Australian megawatts draw on the day it collapsed, and you can see everything was just hunky-dory with a few bumps and blips, and then it was all over, and the timing here comes down to not just 4:18 and 15 seconds. In electricity world, stuff happens so fast. They describe the seconds and the time as 4:18 p.m, 15 and 84 parts of a second. They're describing times here in like to 10,000th of a second. Things happen so quickly. It's all automated, of course, because no human can possibly react that quickly. But basically, at this point, the frequency had dropped from the normal 50. 50 is happy land in electricity world. Do we know the 50 hertz thing? You guys are using 50 hertz too, aren't you? Electricity is, AC electricity is the push-pull 50 times a minute, 50 times a second. And it isn't electricity if it's not going back and forward at 50 times a second. The frequency is really important. It has to be between 49.85 and 50.15, or the engineers in those control labs get very stressed. They get very worried. You don't want to mix your frequencies up. It makes a real mess. I'll show you in a second. Here, it dropped down to 49. That is just crisis territory. And they basically, the rest of Australia had to load shed South Australia. At that point, they were looking at a whole system-wide collapse if they didn't cut the line and just set South Australia loose, which is what they did. But, you know, you look at a graph like that and you think, it's amazing that electricity works. It's got to be there instantly. You can't store it. You can't put it in a shoebox and bring it out later. And you need it to be exactly matching load and supply. And somehow those guys do it. The engineers make it happen on a thousandth of a second basis working. It's remarkable. Now, for those who don't think in frequency very often, I've drawn a graph. I know it's really hard to see. This is like 50 times a second going up and down. And I'm going to add to it a piece of electricity coming off a bit of equipment, and it's coming in at 50.4 because I want to show you what happens when you add slightly different frequencies together. So I've got a program that does that, and this is what you get when you add those two together. You get this kind of what I call lumpy electricity. Like the voltage goes to nothing in about a second and a half. So we can't afford to mess with frequencies. It's one of those things in a system. It's got to be exact. When they kick up a new generator, like from the black start, and they have to restart the whole state, they start with one generator and they gradually add other generators to it. And each one has to be fed in at exactly the right frequency and the right phase. And they do that bit by bit and feed it out. And it's a brilliant job keeping it all running. But frequency is so important, and that's why they had to load shed South Australia. So yeah, that's lumpy electricity. You don't want that. Makes all your computers go a bit funny. Yes, we're happy when it's really close to that. Now, the thing that works so well with our electricity grids is this magic 50 hertz generators. Now, any large generator, so the really big turbines they have in coal plants, and in hydro will do it, nuclear will do it, and I believe some biogas also has turbines big enough to do it. They get these turbines spinning at 50, to produce the same 50 cycles. They're actually spinning at 3,600 RPM, revs per minute, to get a 50 hertz system working. As long as you've got a large, big turbine connected to the grid, spinning at that speed, it's much more stable, obviously, because it's got inertia with it. So that's called spinning reserve, meaning how much of your grid is based on these heavy spinning turbines that keep turning at the right speed. Something called FCAS, an ugly word, frequency control ancillary service, just means now we have to pay people to provide stable frequencies. Back in the days, for decades, when we just used coal and those big turbines, no one really thought about it. They didn't have to put up a market for it, because all the big turbines provided it. It was kind of free. It was part of the system. And so there's a big one. This is one in China, ultra supercritical, 1,000 megawatts, huge turbines. To give you some idea of how big they are, they're 600 tonnes, the big ones. So if you can imagine 600 tonnes of metal spinning at 3,600 times a minute, you get, that is momentum, surely. That's the definition of inertia. You don't mess with those things. It takes hours to speed them up and slow them down. But the great thing about them is when they're connected to the grid, they become a part of the grid. If the grid adds load, you know, everyone turns on their toaster or something somewhere, then the voltage will fall, and those will kind of speed up because there's less resistance on them. So that helps because it means they're feeding into the system. They're a part of the system. On the other hand, if something happens, a lightning strike knocks out a pole and suddenly you've got a lot less demand, they will slow down spinning. So they very much live and breathe and work with the system. It's all good. It's self-governing in a sense. It's brilliant. Oh yeah, I just thought I would do, yeah, 600 tonnes is the weight of like 2 jets. So if you can imagine 2 jets spinning 3,600 times a minute, well, we can't, but anyway. All right, now wind, just to talk about wind for a second, there's 341,000 wind turbines around the world, and soon, any day now, someone is going to do a proper health study on what they mean for the animals and people living close to them. Looking forward to that one. It'll be 341,000 turbines too late, but yes, honestly, health studies in these things, just crazy. In Australia, they've done one study with 6 houses, which was a double-blind kind of study. I mean, seriously, it was amazing they did that study, which did show some effects, especially in houses. Acoustics are so complicated. They found that if people were bending over, they would get these blinding headaches in a certain spot, but not in other spots. And the people who kept logs in the houses didn't know when the wind turbines were on or off, so double blind. They recorded in their diaries how they felt and when they got headaches or when they couldn't sleep, and so someone was able to go back through it later. Only a study of 6 houses, it certainly isn't statistically significant, but it did show that people could tell when the wind turbines were running, the way they wrote down in the diary. They couldn't see them, it was done at night, so they couldn't tell whether the wind turbines were on or off, but they were able to hear or feel or something. Not everyone, but some could, and they didn't like it. And of course there are problems with collecting low density energy, and all infrastructure sometimes has a bad day. And if you Google online, you'll find heaps of these. They're everywhere. But that's true of any infrastructure, but that's part of the point. If you want to capture low density electricity, you've got to have a lot of infrastructure, and it takes a lot of maintenance to keep that running, and they don't tell you about that when they say wind is cheap and solar is free. Wind energy production during July 2015. Capacity factor is a fancy word. It just means how often does it work. In the case of wind in Australia, about a third of the time it's doing something useful, but it comes in these sort of, lumpy packets. To put that in perspective, Hazelwood, remember that big coal plant we shut down? That was the production from Hazelwood, that level there. So for this month, this amount of times, the yellow parts, is when the entire fleet of 43 wind farms in Australia was producing more than one 53-year-old old coal plant about to be closed. So, why does anyone think infrastructure's good when it's not there when you need it? In Australia, some days it's like this. There's the wind contribution somewhere down there, and that's fossil fuels, and that's our electricity grid. Thank goodness we've got fossil fuels. And solar. Yes, solar is a river of money. Not mine, but this is, the death spiral. Australia's installed solar going through the roof as we speak. Something like 6 panels are installed every minute in Australia at the moment. Cry for us. This is where I live, way down here. They've got something like 25% of the houses have solar panels on, now producing 1 gigawatt sometimes. We're only a sort of 2 or 3 gigawatt system down here total. So we have got so much solar power coming in that it's, it's useful in the middle of the day in summer, but the rest of the year it's eating into a load curve which we already have infrastructure to provide. And so it's kind of surplus. WA's, they're now warning we're at risk of some upsetting blackouts and things like that. And part of the problem with having so much solar here and up here, which really works because we have lots of sun, is that it's actually changing the voltage in Australia. And we're on a 240 volt system, which has actually been changed to 230 volts recently. But during midday peak, when the sun hits, we're getting 253 volt systems running through. And the problem with that is it sometimes breaks things. And the other problem is at 253 volts, we're paying more for our electricity because our equipment's using just more juice than it really needs. So our bills go up as well. And sometimes stuff breaks. And to top it off, the solar panels have inverters on the roof. At 253, they cut out. They say, no, game's off, we've got to save the solar panels, and they switch off. So the people who've paid all the money to put the solar on the roof can't get any return at peak at midday when the voltage hits 253 because their stuff switches off automatically. White elephant on the roof. And you don't want white elephants on your roof. Or black ones, brown ones. Solar panels everywhere in Australia. Cry for us. Yeah, and there's a limit to solar panels. We have lots of microgrids. Each one of these is a little tiny kind of self-contained grid. So it's just not enough people to connect it all up. Here in Broome, people get really grumpy because they've installed 10% of their total capacity as solar. And at that point, things start to get so hairy that the company running the system up there said, no more, stop, stop, stop. So we may have lots of subsidies and whatnot up the kazoo, but someone wants a solar panel in Broome, they can't get one because enough people have already got them and it fills 10% of the grid and the whole grid might fall over. So, I mean, again, moral, ethic questions. If you know, we've offered subsidies and cheap electricity to some of the first up, people who jumped in and got it, but if you want one now, bad luck. Don't get me started on solar. Okay, this is the curve. Yeah, I'm sorry, you did get me started. This is a daily load curve, like the amount of electricity consumed, made. It's always the same, consumed and made, because they've got to match. And as, this is in Hawaii, as Hawaii got more solar, the middle of the day needed less. So each year, the middle of the day needed less and less electricity. This kind of shape, you can see it's like there's a head there and a beak and a tail. And I tell you that because the technical name for this curve is a duck curve. That's right, it's called the duck curve in electrical circles. The Californian one is very neat. And you can see 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16 and 2020, the duck is expected to have a big belly in the middle of the day, which means in the middle of the day, all the coal plants or hydro plants or whatever, they just sit around, twiddle their thumbs or, you know, watch those cat videos on YouTube or something because they can't make money and they can't do things. What happens then is on these wings here, we need to ramp up the system. This is called literally ramping up. We have to somehow bring on board a lot of production, energy, generation to make up for solar disappearing, as it seems to do every day at the same time. So they're charging more for this, and that's kind of, in Australia, those spikes we're getting as people charge more when they really need electricity. This is a price, oh, sorry, that is a really messy graph, sorry. Let me just try and explain this a bit. The green line here is price, spike, and there's another spike. And what they're spiking around is the solar production, which is this bit here. So solar in the middle of the day is producing a big hump of electricity, and on each side of it are price spikes in that ramp up period. What we're finding in Australia is that all of the electricity for the whole day gets more expensive on average as we add renewables. But it's cheaper in some bits when you have lots of renewables. Sometimes it's ridiculously cheap in bits. This is the price of electricity one particular day in South Australia. Cheaper in the middle of the day with solar. This is the solar rooftop component in the duck curve. This here is kind of bizarro land where electricity became negative because there was lots of wind in Victoria at like 6:30 in the morning. Prices dropped to minus $44 a megawatt hour. That's right, we had to pay people to take electricity. What kind of crazy market is this? And here, where this is dropped and all the solar proponents go, look, solar's wonderful, it's cheap. It's cheaper than any other time of the rest of the day, except for the wind bizarre aberration. But the truth is, it's still $50 a megawatt hour here, and our average price for the last 30 years was like $30 a megawatt hour. So even at cheap, it isn't as cheap as what it used to be, or as cheap as Hazelwood, which we shut. Consumer surveys in Australia, we're looking at very different prices people are paying. Those with the haves who've got solar pay 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Those without solar are paying over 30. You know, in South Australia, people without solar, 37. I don't know when this graph was done, sorry. The price is almost certainly not that because it changes so much. But the point is, you can see that people with solar panels are saving. They're getting cheaper electricity. They don't use as much. Actually, they do use almost as much. That's another graph. So let's look at that. In theory, putting solar panels on was meant to make people use less electricity, right? What's happened is the opposite. In Queensland, people without solar have been cutting their use of electricity down, 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 down. People with solar initially did, but then it started to do something the opposite, and it's now crossed over, and people with solar are actually using more energy off the grid than people without solar. Why? Because it's so expensive. The people who don't have solar panels can't afford to run the air conditioner, so they sit in a hot house. Those with solar, happy days. It's cheap and they've got the money and they can do it, so they're using more electricity than those without panels. So we've got this wonderful situation now where people who subsidise the solar panels are using less electricity and less air conditioning and paying more for electricity than the people who got the solar panels. Well, let me tell you, when people find out about this in Australia, they're not going to be happy. Yes, I have seen your future, our future, and the future is load shedding. Yes, another word for a blackout. We have offers in Australia where people will say, curb your power, and they're doing things to get people to cut power, giving them handy hints like turn your air conditioning down notches, turn, you know, that kind of thing. Actually, turn your air conditioning up, isn't it? You want the temperature higher so it doesn't use so much electricity. Turn your heating down, be cold, get the flu. So they're giving handy hints, switch off appliances, things like that. That's what's going to save us. They're also doing deals with demand to convince people you don't really need electricity and you can be rewarded for turning off, meaning we'll charge you a fortune for electricity, but if you're really good and you turn it off in the middle of the day or the peak hour when we need it, then we'll give you a rebate, a slight discount on your electricity exorbitant bill. They'll even offer to send people to the movies. I kid you not. They're giving movie tickets, some of the companies, to people so they go and use electricity in the cinema instead of at home. It's just bonkers. They call this managing a grid. So what do you call it when your electricity grid doesn't have enough energy? You call it a peak smart event. Oh, yeah, I'm not kidding. Orwell just lives on in Australia, I swear. A peak smart event, yeah, it's really smart when you don't have enough energy. And you can buy peak smart air conditioning. And that's the kind of air conditioning that turns off when it's peak electricity use, meaning when it's really hot in Australia and everyone else is using their air conditioners. And it's better. The companies will give you a discount on buying an air conditioner if you agree to let them switch off your air conditioner inside your home. And they have little remote controls and they switch them down, but you won't notice it. You won't notice the difference. That's what they all say. And peak smart air conditioning. Oh, my goodness. Oh. Cuba, here we come. Yeah, demand management is another fancy word for 1,000 mini blackouts. It means controlled blackouts. In Sydney, they're paying people $1.5 million to switch off at peak times. There are lots of ways you can demand manage, but it all means mini blackouts, but voluntary ones. Better than random ones. Okay, to put our position in the world in coal in perspective, these are Chinese coal turbines. Remember, China's gone really green. It's got more wind and power and solar than everyone else. It's also got more coal plants than anyone else. The little numbers in the boxes here, they are the numbers of turbines running in that city. So they're numbers like 147, 51, 77, 22. There are some really big numbers over... like, yeah, I think 157 might be the winner. But that's a lot of coal turbines. Okay, so travel down to Australia, to India again. It's got nowhere near as many, but they're coming. A lot of people in India don't have electricity. 300 million or something like that need to get electricity. So they're building them. Here's Australia. Honest. That's our total stock of except it's probably out of date and we've probably shut one down since then and blown it up. But 15 is 16, 13, 14. Look, I don't believe we've got 14 in Perth. That must be counting gas as well. I'm not sure. I'm sure we don't have 14. In any case, you get the picture. We compete with Africa. You know, look, the really sad thing about Africa, look, there's Niger. Niger has about the same electricity draw as a little town in Australia called Dubbo, which has about 40,000 people. This is the tragedy of Africa. How are they ever going to get electrical power there without using lots and lots of coal? And we've got that coal and we can sell it to them. Okay, and here's another thing no one talks about. What's the cost of complexity? In Australia now, when you get an electricity bill, you have to think, do I want to be with this provider, that provider, on their peak smart conditioning thing with the air conditioners? Should I just stick with my normal air conditioner? When I get a pool pump, should I install a separate circuit and only run the pool pump for 18 hours a day and not 6 peak hours a day because I'll get a discount if I put in that separate electrical circuit and separate, you know. How much of our lives do we want to spend figuring out our electricity bill and how to manage our equipment, and how much of our lives would we rather be going on holiday or, you know, watching TV or playing with our kids or something else? Okay, sorry, I just had to put that. It's a lovely photo. Okay, step 6, and you're saying, hey, where was step 5? Well, look, it's just like renewables. Just because we say there were 3 steps when there's really 20, or it's, you know, that's how it goes. Look, you've got to stop people asking questions. I'm coming near to the end of the talk, but step 6 is really important. If you want to destroy a grid, you've got to make sure people don't ask the obvious. And how do you do that? Well, calling names is really effective. So call them deniers, because if they deny that your coal plant is changing the weather, then just call them stupid deniers. It's like they've got a lizard brain, it's like they don't think, or perhaps they're more like, you know, Nazis or, you know, some hangover there from the Holocaust. But they're really, really bad people. And if you say this loudly enough and often enough and jump up and down, good people will stay quiet. And they will say, oh, and then you win. So being a bully kind of pays, doesn't it? Do we think maybe it's time that we started to stand up to the bullies and the name calling and call it for what it is? Because as long as we're quiet, they keep getting away with it. And as long as they're talking and we're not, we get these bizarre systems and we destroy things. And yeah, look, I could talk about each of these 3 men. I'm not sure how much time or Valium you've got to cope with what's really going on in Australia. Australian voters are polarised. Just the last slide, I'm just going to explain that over here, this is the strongly opposed category to the question, should Australia adopt measures to curb CO2 emissions? This is the strongly enthusiastic about paying money to the UN to stop the tide coming in and stuff. And in the middle is almost nobody. Our Conservative parties, and these are coloured according to the way they vote, so Conservatives kind of blue and purple here, and, you know, green and red are, well, obviously green and red, Green and Labor. But there's no one in the middle. It's a polarised situation because of the name calling, because of the ridiculous situation, and we haven't had a fair debate. In a normal society, we'd have a bell curve that would look like that, and most people would be in the middle. But it's not like that because it's not a discussion, it's not a debate, there is no debate. And so over here we've got our Conservative Party, which is aiming for the centre. Good one, guys. They're aiming for basically a policy vacuum, a place where there are no people. And over here the Greens and whatnot are serving their voters, which I guess is fair, it's what happens in a democracy. But mostly our Conservative parties are all too chicken, too afraid that someone's going to call them a climate denier, and therefore they kowtow and say climate change is real and the UN is important and we should pay them lots of money. And then they aim to win the centre and wonder why they lose a lot of the time. So the message here for Conservative politicians is to brave up and just call it like it is. It worked for Tony Abbott. He won in Australia by 90, which is like 24 seats more than he needed to win an election. It was the largest electoral victory in 20 years in Australia. Donald Trump did it. Another guy, Codine in Ottawa, has done it in Canada. They just call it like it is. Just stand up and speak the truth and the crowd votes for it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to come and talk to you.